London, 1940. The city burns under German bombs. Smoke rises over shattered homes, yet one voice refuses to break. That voice belonged to Winston Churchill, the man who stood when the world fell silent. He was the Bulldog of Britain, the defender of democracy, the man America hailed as a hero. But what? Because the same man who saved freedom also ordered famine, defended empire, and called entire races uncivilized. This is not the story of a villain or a saint. It's the story of a man who embodied both, and how history chose to remember only half. So tonight, let's revisit the legacy of Winston Churchill, the savior of freedom and the architect of suffering. Because to truly understand history, we must first dare to question its heroes.
Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born not in a cottage, but in a palace, Blenheim, the ancestral fortress of dukes and conquerors. From the moment he opened his eyes, he was told he was destined for greatness. But destiny has a way of blinding men before it blesses them. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising star in politics, brilliant but cruel. His mother, Jenny Jerome, an American socialite, was adored by everyone except her own son.
Neglected and desperate for approval, Winston found refuge in stories of conquest and empire. He didn't dream of love, he dreamed of glory. At Harrow and Sandhurst, he learned the art of leadership and the religion of empire. By his 20s, Churchill saw the world not as a collection of nations, but as a hierarchy of civilizations. Some meant to rule, others meant to obey.
His first battles weren't in Europe, but in the empire. Sudan, South Africa, India. He went not as a soldier of justice, but as a believer in imperial destiny. He wrote of savages and barbarians, words that would stain his legacy long after his victories faded. To Churchill, empire wasn't oppression, it was order. And in that belief, he found purpose and blindness.
History remembers him as the savior of liberty. But before he saved it, he spent decades defending its opposite.
By his 30s, Winston Churchill was more than a soldier. He was a man addicted to destiny. He changed parties twice, not for loyalty, but for survival. To Churchill, conviction meant little if it didn't lead to influence. He craved the spotlight like oxygen, yet feared irrelevance more than death. That fear drove him through every triumph and every blunder.
In 1915, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he dreamed of glory at Gallipoli. Instead, he sent thousands to die in one of Britain's greatest military disasters. The nation turned on him. He was banished from power, humiliated, forgotten. But Churchill was never one to accept defeat. He returned to writing, painting, and reflection. But even in exile, he was haunted by the ghosts of men who died following his orders.
Then, in 1939, history called him back. The storm of war gathered again, and Britain needed a lion. At last, the world saw him as he saw himself, a man born to lead in catastrophe. Under his leadership, Britain stood alone against Hitler's empire. And in that defiance, Churchill became immortal.
But even in his finest hour, Churchill's shadow grew longer, because for every village he defended in Europe, there was another he ignored in Asia or Africa. He spoke of freedom, yet ruled over millions denied it. He condemned tyranny, yet defended empire. To him, liberty had borders. Power had become his purpose. And when men believe they are the empire, they forget that even empires can.
1943. While Britain fought for freedom, another empire was dying, quietly, unseen. In Bengal, the fields turned to dust and millions began to starve. Ships carrying grain sailed past starving shores, bound not for Bengal, but for Britain's war effort. When India's leaders begged for relief, Churchill replied, "If food is scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?"
It was one of the darkest moments of the British Empire. Historians estimate over 3 million dead, yet the famine barely made headlines in the West. To Churchill, it was a tragedy of circumstance. To the people of Bengal, it was a crime of indifference. Even as he led Britain to victory in Europe, the empire he loved was dying from within, rotting under its own contradictions.
He had defeated Hitler, but he could not defeat time. The world that rose after the war no longer had a place for empires. In 1945, voters removed him from power. The hero of victory was quietly shown the door. He would return once more to office in the 1950s, older, slower, haunted. But history had already moved on.
He had built his life on the idea of greatness and found at the end that greatness always demands a price. For every man history calls a savior, there lies another story, one that history whispers. When the bombs stopped falling and the flags came down, the world remembered Winston Churchill as the man who never surrendered. America adored him. He was the voice of defiance, the image of courage, and the symbol of the free world. But history has layers, and heroes shadows. The same man who inspired democracy also justified empire. The same voice that rallied the world silenced millions who had none. Was he evil? No. But was he good? That's a question history is still too afraid to answer.
Maybe the truth is simpler and harder. Churchill wasn't a monster or a saint. He was human, brilliant, flawed, and blinded by the world that created him. He gave his country hope when it needed it most, but he never gave the same to those beneath the empire's flag. Perhaps that is the paradox of power. Every light that shines bright casts a shadow just as long. Churchill's legacy still stands in bronze and marble, but it also lives in debate, in the courage to ask, who decides who is a hero?
Because history is not carved in stone. It's written in questions. And maybe the greatest act of remembrance is to keep asking them. This was Winston Churchill, the savior of freedom and the keeper of empire. A man who won the world's admiration and left it with a question it still cannot answer.